From Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, by Ferdinand Lundberg and Marina Farnham, MD, published by Harper and Brothers, 1947. As its title suggests, this book is about women. In it, they are presented as one of modern civilization's major unsolved problems. It does not deal with women as a general historical or evolutionary riddle, which they unquestionably are, but as a specific one produced by our own times. For in our times, women have become, in sober truth, a riddle within a riddle. Women in general are more complicated question than men, for they are more complicated organisms. They are endowed with a complicated reproductive system, a more elaborate nervous system, and an infinitely complex psychology revolving about the reproductive function. Women, therefore, cannot be regarded as any more similar to men than a spiral is to a straight line. With the loss of the self-contained traditional home, women's inner balance was disastrously upset. That even the most self-conscious of them did not fully realize what was happening and do not to this day is beside the essential point. Modern women's psyche was profoundly shaken. How did women react in behavior, attitudes, and feelings to what happened? Their general reaction can be made plain by examining two broad groups: the feminists, from mild to extreme, and the non-feminists. These two groups may also be called the careerists and homemakers, although the two are not necessarily separated. Feminism, despite the external validity of its political program and most, not all, of its social program, was at its core a deep illness. But the feminists of the past and of today were not, in our view, exclusively neurotic among women. They merely showed their neuroticism in a different way. Psychologically, feminism had a single objective: the achievement of maleness by the female, or the nearest possible approach to it. Insofar as it was attained, it spelled only vast individual suffering for men as well as women, and much public disorder. Now, what did Lundberg and Farnham see as the solution to this problem that had no name other than neurotic maladjustment to the modern order? 1, psychotherapy for women. 2, Federal Department of Welfare with an educational program to encourage the reconstruction of family life, quote, a governmental supervisory agency devoted to serving women who live as women, that is, women as mothers. 3, cash payments to mothers and other incentives to get women back into the home. 4, a program to help women put aside labor-saving devices in the home and recapture the feeling that household labor is valuable and not just drudgery. And finally, turning away from the unfortunate focus on momentary pleasures to understanding the fundamental pleasures and happiness of devotion to the home and the family. This was 1947, the year that Betty Naomi Goldstein married Caryl Friedan, 5 years after she was graduated from Smith College, began raising 3 children, and continued to write. Welcome tonight to the Discoveries Lecture in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Feminine Mystique. This lecture series is a partnership between the Boston University Alumni Association and the College of Arts and Sciences. This series remains a cornerstone in our philosophy of extending the learning community to alumni and friends and reflecting the breadth of the liberal arts education. I'd also like to extend a greeting to those of you joining us live around the world via our online webcast. We encourage you who are out there on the web to join the conversation via Twitter by tweeting questions to @BU Alumni or using the hashtag BU Discoveries. I will introduce the panel members first, and then each in turn will offer about 10 minutes of comments on the evening's topic, the Feminine Mystique, 50 years later. Following our comments, we will open up the floor for questions. There will be a couple of mics on the floor when it's time for questions. Please wait for those signals so we can use the mics, and you'll be heard during the streaming and later by recording. So I'm now very pleased to introduce the panel. I'm going to do it alphabetically because that's what's in front of me, and they will wave to indicate which one they are. So alphabetically, beginning with Eileen Boris, CLA 1970, is the Hull Professor and Chair of the Department of Feminist Studies and Professor of History and Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. At Boston University, she managed, in her own words, to graduate summa cum laude with distinction as a double major in American history and civilization and English language and literature, even though she was busy occupying Marsh Chapel and was there when Bill Baird broke the Massachusetts law on birth control. Thanks to English instructor Elizabeth Barker, she writes she was part of the GE College Bowl group that went into Walpole State Prison to practice with a prisoner team, which was the origins of a prison education program at BU. She's the prize-winning author of Home to Work, Motherhood and the Politics of Industrial Homework in the U.S., which won the 1995 Philip Taft Prize in Labor History, and with Jennifer Klein, Caring for America, Home Health Workers in the Shadow of the Welfare State, which won the 2012 Sarah Whaley Prize in Women and Work from the National Women's Studies Association. Next, let me introduce Susan Reverby, who is the Marion Butler McLean Professor in the History of Ideas and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College. She received her PhD from the American Studies program at Boston University in 1982. While our program, she says, was once described as full of wives, that is, women who went to BU because they had husbands, partners in the Boston area, she writes, we turned out the third highest number of PhDs in women's history in the United States in the mid-1970s to early 1980s, and we all went on to various kinds of academic positions. Reverby was Wellesley's first hire into their women's studies program, half-time, 1 year to start, and 30 years later, it is a department with 7 faculty and scores of majors. Next, we have Caryl Rivers, Professor of Journalism in the Boston University College of Communication. Calm, folks? Woo-woo.
Yes.
She was the 2007 winner of the Helen Thomas Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Professional Journalists. She is a nationally known author, journalist, columnist, and media critic, and has been reporting about and commenting on American life and politics for 4 decades. She is one of the famous girls in the balcony at the National Press Club in Washington, a reference to the fact that women reporters had to be in the balcony to cover speeches there, and there were no chairs, so they had to lean on the balcony to write. Caryl interviewed Betty Friedan a number of times, and in fact, Betty Friedan hosted a book party in her New York apartment for Caryl and her co-authors to celebrate the publication of their book, Beyond Sugar and Spice, which was, of course, a feminist book. Carol's forthcoming book with Rosalind Barnett is The New Soft War Against Women, to be published by Penguin. Next, we have Roberta Salper, who majored in Spanish at Boston University and graduated in August 1959. Her mentor at BU is Maria Luisa Osorio, who did not get tenure. The department then was all male. And Roberta is still in contact with Professora Osorio. Roberta then received a master's and PhD degrees in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University, started her academic career at the University of Pittsburgh in 1968, and became the first full-time faculty member in the nation's first women's studies program in 1970 at San Diego State University. She published one of the first anthologies in the women's liberation movement, Feminist Liberation, History and Current Politics, published by Alfred Knopf in 1971. She's currently a resident scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University and has just completed a memoir, Domestic Subversive. She has been a part-time instructor in the Spanish department at BU since 2005, and she loves BU students. And finally, I'm Virginia Sapiro, the Dean of Arts and Sciences and a professor of political science, and for 31 years was a professor of political science and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I taught using various works by most of these people. My main connection to BU before arriving here was that in 1970, I was a sophomore at Clark University, and most of the universities in Massachusetts were shut down by strikes. I was the phone coordinator for our campus participation in a demonstration designed to stop the cars on the Mass Pike. I was the Worcester coordinator, and the main Boston coordinator at the other end of the phone line was, I don't know who, but it was a Boston University student. And like Eileen Boris, I was involved in one of the actions by Bill Baird in Worcester to try to help legalize contraception. So with that, let me welcome the panel, welcome you. And I'm going to ask my distinguished panelists just to go down the line and say their piece, and I will wrap it up. So.
Hi. Do you want me to stand, or can I?
We can sit here if you're comfortable.
Okay. Everybody hear me? Good. I want to share two experiences in my life when the feminine mystique made a difference. During most of the 1960s, until 1968, I was living in Madrid, Spain, married to a Spanish Marxist. The son, well, that's true. The son of a prominent and wealthy family of anti-fascists. Francisco Franco was the dictator of Spain between 1939 and 1975, and official and unofficial misogyny was ubiquitous. Along with my then husband, I became active in anti-fascist activities, some of them clandestine, and I learned and read about Marxism. I gave a speech in Madrid to the Spanish Association of University Women in 1967 on a topic of my choosing. And I said, the role of women in the American university. This is 1967. About which I knew very little, except that we were not equal to male academics. I wrote to the dean at Radcliffe, and she sent me Jessie Bernard's Academic Women, which was published in 1964, the only thing then, right? When I gave the speech, I defined myself as a Marxist and a feminist, but not a particularly knowledgeable one. My first interaction with Betty Friedan came in preparation for that speech. I recalled that initial interaction with Betty Friedan in a memoir I've just finished, and I will share it with you. This is from the memoir. I had never met an American feminist, but I read Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique to prepare for the speech that I would deliver in April 1967 at Madrid's International Institute. Although I recognized my mother's plight in Friedan's descriptions of married life in the 1950s, and I certainly shared some of the malaise Betty Friedan identified in her book, I did not know anyone else who did, and Friedan's analysis did not satisfy me. She talked about the illness with no name, that awful psychological oppression, the enormous frustration, anger, bitterness that lay just below the surface for countless women who had been socialized into believing that true women accepted secondary status in society. All of that certainly resonated with me, but the solution she suggested was incomplete and did not go to the root of the problem. Her answer to combating male supremacist practices was to fight for certain reforms that amounted to getting men out of the way so as to make room for women. That is, freeing women from the institutionalized discrimination that maintained male dominance. Crucial reforms, to be sure, but Betty Friedan was talking about improving the lot of women like herself, and I knew that middle-class women were only a part of the female population. I had seen what working-class poverty did to too many women in Spain to forget about them. Abolishing discrimination against women might open the way for a female head of state, a corporation president, and female generals, but a factory girl would remain a factory girl. A maid would remain a maid. It seemed to me that unless a women's movement made changing the status of women like Juanita and Vicenta, the domestic workers in my ex-husband's parents' home, that I knew in Madrid, their status was as important as achieving more opportunities for my former upper middle class Spanish sister-in-law or for me in the United States. Unless the status was changed for all the classes, the fundamental causes of women's oppression would not be eliminated. But I knew, even then, that the arena where I would be most effective in promulgating progressive change for women would be in academia, among middle-class women. My roots were there, and the stimulus to revolt had sprung from this world. As I searched for more data for my lecture, I found there were practically no books that dealt with women in the university, a subject generally assumed to have little intrinsic, let alone market value. Okay, that's the excerpt from this fascinating memoir. Okay.
Which you'll all be able to buy. So.
You can buy, yeah. No, it's not quite done, but it's called Domestic Service. It's done, but not published yet. Okay, my second interaction with the Feminine Mystique was in January 1969 when I co-taught the first Women's Studies course at the University of Pittsburgh. There were 58 young women and 2 young men in the course. The first class, I asked everyone to write a paragraph visualizing a day in their life when they were 55. 49 of the women said they would be married to a wonderful man with children. 4 said they would be grade school teachers, and the 2 males said professor or engineer. Then we read Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan was the takeoff point for our journey together during that semester. For me, it was an exhilarating experience I'll never forget. So I'm grateful to Betty Friedan for her courage and intelligence. She was a singular American woman. Thank you.
Well, I must say that the first time I got what was called the click moment by feminists, the moment when you suddenly realized, holy smoke, you know, you've really been discriminated against, was indeed when I was one of the few women reporters sort of allowed to cover things in Washington. I was a young reporter, couldn't belong to the National Press Club, was one of the girls in the balcony, and that means I had to go upstairs to the balcony, and while all the men sat down in their comfy chairs and I leaned on the, you know, the railing writing my stuff. And one day I was assigned to do a profile on Caryl Rivers, who's the first African-American head of the United States Information Agency. So he was giving a speech at the press club, and I followed him in, fully thinking I would just sort of sit right on the front table so I could take my notes. I was literally grabbed by two burly guys and practically half dragged up to the balcony. So there I was leaning over the balcony, and Caryl Rivers was giving his speech. And he talked about how, as a boy in McMinnville, Tennessee, he could not sit on the first floor of the movie theater, but he and other African-American people were sent to the balcony. And I saw these white liberal reporters going, oh, Troy's ready. And boy, did I have this click. Hey, guess where I am? I am in the balcony. And at that time, there was no woman editor for the newspaper. There was no woman bureau chief. There was no woman correspondent on television. The prospects for somebody like me who wanted to be a journalist, the doors were absolutely closed. You maybe could sort of sneak in and find a little spot somewhere, but there was no career path up there because women were just not supposed to do that. Maybe for a couple of years before you got married, but you really weren't supposed to do it. And so I really identified with Betty Friedan's dilemma, because I looked around me and saw a lot of people who had dreams and ambitions and were told you're absolutely, it's either penis envy or you're, somehow psychologically demented and what's wrong with you anyhow. And so I thought The Feminine Mystique was a very important book because it opened up a conversation that led to a movement that has been an amazing human rights movement. But if Betty were to come back today, I think she'd look around, she'd be pleased that 3 women on the Supreme Court and combat roles opening up for women, but she was a journalist, she'd look around and see, guess what? Things are not the way they should be. In fact, women are stalling out all over the place. And in the soft war, the new soft war against women, Dr. Roz Barnett and I are looking, and we look around and it really surprises us the things that aren't happening. Women have made great gains in education. They're getting more PhDs, they're getting more education, but guess what? These things have not translated into money and influence. Women aren't getting to the top at anything like the rate you would have expected because of their education and early promise. They're doing great in college, but as they move up the ladder, they stall out. For example, in 2011, a typical college-educated woman, 25 years or older, working full-time, earned $50,000 a year compared to $70,000 a year for educated male workers of the same qualification in the same age group. It was $20,000 a year over a lifetime, $700,000 that this graduate is going to be down. Female graduates from Harvard learn 30% less than their male counterparts. Women's representation in corporate boardrooms and executive suites is shrinking. It's not growing, despite all this nonsense you've heard about the end of men. Absolute garbage. The head of the think tank Catalyst, Eileen Lang, said, "This is our 5th report where the annual change in female readership remained flat. If this trend line represented a patient's pulse, she'd be dead." Then there's one of my favorites, the mommy tax. It's interesting how you can be moving up the ladder and working and honored by your peers, and suddenly you have a child. Instantly your brain dies. People look at you and they say, you're going to always want to be running home, you're not going to be committed to work, you're not going to be able to think, you're not going to be able to focus. And the interesting thing about the mommy tax is what's your lifetime loss of earning in terms of the rest of your life? In general, a college-educated woman has a child, she will lose about $1 million in lifetime earnings. $1 million, that's a lot. Interestingly enough, there's a fatherhood bonus. There's a motherhood tax and there's a fatherhood bonus. And what that means is that while mothers are looked upon as brain dead, when a man has a child, suddenly he's looked upon as responsible, not running around to do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. He's going to be a wonderful employee. And there's a terrific study out of Wall Street where mothers work 92% as many hours as fathers, but they only earn 53% as much money. However, the fathers, they worked 90% as much as the childless men. And guess what? They earned more. They earned 122% as much money as the childless men. So, you know, I mean, there's the one of the differences that you can look forward to. Interesting stuff. Men get second chances when they make mistakes. Women don't. The idea with a man is, yeah, he's going to go out and he's going to reach for it, he's going to take risks, and if he falls flat on his butt, dust him off, he's a good guy, he'll have another chance. A woman does the same, and it looks like she can't do it, she can't hack it, she hasn't got the right stuff, end of her promotions. She's going to flatline. Men are promoted on promise, and women are promoted on performance. So if you'll notice how many times, and we interviewed a lot of women for this book, the woman would say, God, I worked hard, I won awards, I did, you know, I performed brilliantly. And they hired this young guy, and they appointed him to the editorship or the partnership or whatever, and not me. And one woman that I know was promoted to was second in command of a large department in a newspaper. And after working brilliantly for 10 years, the senior editor left and hired a 24-year-old man. The woman was 38. And she went in and she said to him, why did you hire him? And the man said, he reminds me of me. So one of the big problems that women still have is, you know, it's hard because men still hold a lot of the hiring positions. They don't remind their boss of him when he was however many years old. If a woman works on a project with a man, he gets the credit even if she does all of the work. Because the man is assumed, if there's a woman and a man, the man is assumed he's the leader, he's the person who's doing the work. One of the things that really struck me was that you are the stereotype. If people have no information about you, whether you're a man or a woman, you walk in the door, you are judged by the stereotype. Both men and women do this. So if a man walks in the door and he's reasonable looking and you know, not falling down on his face from having 18 beers, he is regarded as being forceful, active, a leader. If a woman walks in the door, she is regarded as being probably not too competent, probably not too smart, not committed to work, nice, but, you know, not anybody you'd really want to hire. I mean, if Sonia Sotomayor walked in the door and people did not know who she was, if she didn't say, I'm a Supreme Court Justice, if she did that, they'd say, pretty good. But if she walked in and didn't give any information, she would be regarded as, hey, send her out for coffee, you know, she'll probably go. Whereas a man gets a free pass, and that's really interesting. So we are still fighting all the time. If you're a woman, you've got to keep saying, I did this, I did this, I did this, because nobody's going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And I think Betty Friedan would have, she'd really have understood that kind of action. And we talk about the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling isn't really the good image. What surprised Roz and I was the cumulative power of stereotypes over a woman's career. It's not like a woman gets in there, takes off for the skies, and runs into this barrier she hasn't seen. The real image is the hurdles. That from the beginning, there are a bunch of barriers that women don't see, and they can be knocked out of the race at any time. And so what you see is that when women are, when they're running this hurdle race, they're carrying this big backpack. The man is running, he's going over the hurdles pretty much unencumbered. And she is running with the backpack of all these discriminatory ideas that still are really there about women. And so no wonder that she's not going as far and as fast. And as for the end of men, by the way, the idea was that men are taking all the college seats, women are taking all the college seats and men are failing. The latest data shows that for white men and women of appropriate college age, the difference is 2%. Women occupy seats at a 2% a greater level than men. And I'll stop there.
Great. I hope you can hear me. I got one of these respiratory cruds a month ago, and it's still here. So, okay. Well, I want to begin with a confession. I was one of those young feminists who skipped Betty Friedan to go straight to no more fun and games and the dialectic of sex when I incorporated feminism into a new left politics that focused on race and class. My old Dell paperback edition dates from October 1972, so I must have read the Feminine Mystique in graduate school where I was at Brown. But I was a beneficiary of the social and cultural changes that Friedan charted and facilitated. My mom, however, was the unpaid vice president of my father's small business and labored much longer and harder at home for the family and for Ralph Boris and Company. The problem that had an invisible name, the erasure of my mother's name on the company masthead, and the non-recognition of the worth of her labors. On the one hand, she was a negative model, doing for everybody without appreciation. You know, oh, you can't do your hair right. You don't, you know, let me put the curlers in you. Okay. On the other hand, I learned that women could be competent, creative, and energetic, and actually more efficient than men. She knew how to make do, survival skills that historians associate with working class, African American, and immigrant women, which her mother was. Home and work. These are the themes of the Feminine Mystique, and it just so happens they happen to be the topics that have obsessed me for the last 30 or 40 years. Friedan saw too much home and not enough work, which she defined as employment, especially a career. I asked, how do we organize the making of people and their maintenance and the generating of income? And how do and should people combine the two? In looking at home labors, paid and unpaid, I've charted the centrality of housework and care work, reproductive labors, we might call them, to gender, class, and racial orders, or if I want to be controversial, patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy. Now, in 1963, Friedan critiqued the happy housewife heroine, pointing to the quiet desperation of women through a constructed portrait of the modern American housewife. As the writings of historians were discovering the 19th century cult of domesticity, the home of the 1950s in Friedan's book appeared as a place of confinement. At one point, she even compares it to a concentration camp, the same analogy that Stanley Elkins was making for black slavery, the same moment. Friedan actually, as we know, captured the picture of some white middle-class women who, more than other women, were for a short time able to remain outside of the labor force and found paid work away from the home, maybe an attractive alternative to boredom within. These were the women whose access to education and other resources, including a white male wage, made it more likely that their work could be interesting and creative. But in trading in Freud for the philosophy of psychologist Abraham Maslow, I mean, she did do doctoral work in psychology, Friedan neglected the lives of most women who, even in the 1950s and 1960s, found that they had to work, often part-time, at a job, not a profession, not for joy, but to make ends meet, to cement that middle-class lifestyle. What had changed from the early 20th century was not women's contribution to the family economy, but its location and form, from inside the home to outside, from services to wages. Now, I'm not going to exactly make the usual critique of Friedan, captured beautifully in a letter that historian Stephanie Kuntz has unearthed from the Friedan papers at Radcliffe, written by a civil rights left-wing housewife activist, someone also associated with the Communist Party, which Friedan was around. And this letter condemned Friedan's focus, quote, solely to the problem of middle-class, college-educated women rather than, quote, working women, especially Negro women, who labor not only under the disadvantages imposed by the feminine mystique, but under the more pressing disadvantages of economic discrimination. The writer of that letter, the late Gerda Lerner, who had not yet become the pioneer in women's history that we all know her to be. Instead, I'm going to assert that Friedan learned the wrong lesson from the communist milieu that she lived in the 1940s and early 1950s, a world of politics, ideas, and struggles, which, as Daniel Horowitz, another historian, has shown, she covered up to address other college-educated, white middle-class Smith graduates, and et cetera, as just another suburban housewife. That was her persona. She embraced the dictum of Frederick Engels in The Origins of the Family, Private Property in the State of 1884, in which Engels essentially said that the problem was that, quote, the modern individual family is founded on the open or concealed domestic slavery of the wife. And second, that if she carries out her duties in the private service of the family, she remains excluded from public production and unable to earn. And third, to quote Engels, the first condition for the liberation of the wife is to bring the whole female sex back into public industry. That is, women had to go out to work in order to join together in social struggle and work for the common good. But there was another communist analysis, one eventually embraced by sectors of women's liberation, but discredited by the Communist Party publicly and loudly during the time when Betty Friedan worked for the Federated Press and UE News. Mary Inman was a California activist, and in 1940 she came out with In Women's Defense, arguing that housework, like factory work, was productive labor. Like many Marxist feminist theorists of domestic labor some 30 years later, who debated whether housework produced use or exchange values, but I won't go into that right now, you'll fall asleep. But the point was, Inman claimed that it was the dissing of housework and the housewife, of child rearing and household maintenance. That's what led to women's subordination, not the economic function of the work itself that produced future and present labor power. That is, what did the housewife do? She socializes the children, she makes sure they're presentable, that they don't kill themselves because they have appropriate norms, the kind of maternal thinking that the late Sarah Ruddock talked about, and she makes sure that the worker, assumed as a male worker, can go out to work the next day by giving him sex and giving him food. So, it was reproductive labor. And indeed, this acting out of this premise during the 1930s and beyond was part of the social struggles that women engaged in at the point of reproduction or consumption. Struggles over decent and affordable housing, the price of food, the quality of schools, community services, much as Friedan did when she moved to Parkway Village in Queens in the early 1950s. But the McCarthy years led to a focus on individual women, not collective demands, though education appeared as a safe arena for community activism in which she engaged in. And meanwhile, the Communist Party's mass women's organization of those years, the Congress of American Women, had by the late 40s focused on all this and more, on child care centers and maternity benefits, on anti-discrimination by race as well as sex. And Gerda Lerner was part of that struggle. Reproductive labors couldn't be done without social supports. Now, don't get me wrong. Friedan channeled the social science and historical insight that, as she put it, housewifery expands to fill the time available, as she put it, and that technology meant, as a later historian said, more work for mother. And it's hard to defend the routine cleaning, cooking, and diapering of domestic labor as anything but work that keeps on needing renewal. Indeed, in longing for an unalienated labor, Friedan has a utopian quality, shared by the autonomous work of Marxists today, who critique the equation of work as life and envision a realm of species being, that a realm of freedom. Nonetheless, Friedan's dismissal of housework had real consequences. And if you read over the Feminine Mystique, she refers to housework as something that an average or normal human intelligence doesn't do. It's equated with imbeciles and with people who don't have adult capacity. Well, if it isn't worthy of the intelligent woman, what are the implications for women who do housework, not out of love, but for money? Remember, African American women still predominated in 1960 as the nation's cleaners, maids, and household workers. And today it is women of color, immigrant and US born, who, as one activist for decent work for domestics asserted, do the work in households that enables others to go out and be economically active. It is us who take care of your precious children and your sick and elderly. We cook your food to keep you healthy, and we look after your property when you are away. That is, we who are the oils in the world and the wheels of the global economy make work possible for other women. So one legacy of the feminine mystique is divisions among women, but one way that we can overcome that is joining together in caring across the generation, the new initiative of the National Domestic Workers Alliance.
I'm just going home, actually, so. I want to respond to it in two ways. As a woman who entered college the year the book came out, and as a historian thinking back on my reaction to it, although Eileen stole my quote on Gerda Lerner, so we actually read the same things. But historians, what is the problem? As a woman in 1963 and someone who was active in SDS, in the anti-war movement, in the civil rights movement, and then the women's movement by the late 60s in New York, I never read Friedan. I never thought it was relevant. I thought that Friedan, in fact, was the problem that had a name. A kind of focus on the unhappiness of the white suburban housewife, as Eileen has said, and the need for an identity outside of motherhood. And I wasn't that. I was in a male-defined field. I actually have an undergraduate degree in industrial and labor relations, which, thank God, made me a labor historian. And my identity developed, frankly, as a movement person, as someone who was active in making change. I worked with women of color in my first job. I did political work, and I watched what those women did, and I found an identity, and my identity was in making the revolution and in being part of social change. And I grew up with a mother who raised 4 children, but who worked as well, and so I thought Friedan had nothing to do with me. And so for me, and I think a number of women of my generation, 1963 was marked not by Friedan's book, but by the bombing in September of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and the killing of 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carolyn Robertson, Denise McNair, whose names we almost never remember, and even Spike Lee's movie is called 4 Little Girls and doesn't even name them in the title. And then, of course, by November that year, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the beginnings of the escalation of the Vietnam War. So it was those events, I think, that shaped the feminism of my generation and of the socialist feminism that I was part of, and the need to see institutional solutions and organized ways of going about it. And our identities were forged within the civil rights movement and the radical and anti-war movements of the 60s. So even after being drawn into the women's movement through consciousness-raising groups in the late 60s, I actually didn't even still see the relevance of Friedan. And in fact, when I taught her briefly when I got to Wellesley to teach women's studies, I thought of her as providing what you call in biology the founder effect. That is, in genetics, when a newly formed colony is small, its founder can affect the entire population well into the future because that gene pool gets reproduced in very small numbers. That was the problem for us of Friedan. The way in which feminism became associated with the problem of only one group of people and the assumption that work, in fact, would be the solution turned out to be a problem. And in fact, when I was at Wellesley, the first thing I had to do, I think the second year I was there, the president asked me to give a speech to the incoming first years. This is 1983, called Feminism, What's in a Name? And why did we need this terminology any longer? Given what Carol's talking about, it's really interesting to think about it. But I think what the problem was that Friedan's founder's effect was that the women's movement and the idea of feminism then became labeled as a very narrow terminology, and most of us have spent the rest of our professional and political careers trying to overcome that perception. And Friedan gets caught up in the attack on lesbians, for example, in the 70s when she talked about the lavender menace. And so the problem became explaining the mystique about the mystique, actually. And Friedan became the problem that had a name and that we had to, in fact, deal with it. On the other hand, the key thing that she did, and as someone who spends a lot of time talking to my students about this, if you don't know there's a problem and you cannot describe it, then there can be no political work around it. And so what Friedan did for us was to give it a name. And that, I think, is the genius, essentially, of the work. So as a historian thinking back on this, we now know from the work that's done biographically, Eileen suggested this, that Friedan, like, if you think about it, the way the women who tell women not to work and go back to home, of course, are speaking publicly. So if you think about Phyllis Schlively telling everybody to go back to work while she's busy working, Friedan in some ways is similar. That is, Friedan's moaning about an explanation of what was going on in the suburbs was not her own history in any way, and we know that now from the really wonderful biographies that have now been written, and Eileen's talked about this, so I won't go into it a lot, and we know a lot more about what was going on in her own personal life, and she reflected, and it's too bad actually that she didn't write more about it, about the tension that actually goes on in a household when two people are actually trying to take care of both children and move on in their own careers. That affects lesbian couples and trans couples as much as it affects male and female couples. It is about how are we going to organize all of this. So, so in a sense, I think what happened is that she didn't give us a strong enough history of what was going on, but we should, in fact, use the book, and I think as a historical text. Now, I think we should understand it in the light of the new biographies. This give us a sense of what she didn't do and did do, and it's really interesting to think about why, in fact, that happened. That is, why did she make this particular political move at that point to try to explain it in this way, and why have we all spent our lives, in fact, dealing with that issue. But I think what she did name for us is what I would think of as the unfinished business of the women's movement in many ways. That is, the definitions of what counts as masculinity and femininity, the limitations of that as a binary that I think is very much still at work. The unfinished business of work and family conflict, which she alluded to but never really talked about. And for her, the solution was to see women as full human beings, to use Maslow's ideas about needs as a way to understand that, and the limitations I think we've all learned about why education itself is not the answer, and the structural reasons that this oppression continues has to be really fully realized and discussed, and it has to be done, as Eileen has said, across the world and for every woman that exists, and every man as well. Thank you.
I'm just going to make a few comments of reflection on this book, and then we'll open up for questions. So I hope you're thinking of good questions. Throughout my academic career, I've been very interested in the confluence of historical time and biographical time. How do we understand history and the movements of events and of culture and of societies? And how do we understand our own biographies and how those come together? Where we step into that larger river, and if you listen carefully, you can really detect the different ways we stepped into that river. And then as you go through both your life and historical time, how your perspective on both changes. And I would say very strongly that when I first became involved in the feminist movement and in beginning to think as a pre-scholar about gender and women's issues, Betty Friedan was completely irrelevant to me. She really meant nothing. I was the college class of 1972, and I know very well that I read Shulamit's Firestone first. I read Sheila Rowbotham first. I read, probably in graduate school, my colleague is a graduate student, Gail Rubin, first. Mm-hmm. And so the kinds of things you can tell that Eileen and I stepped into the river roughly at the same time, because the language that I used at that point was the labor of reproductive labor, and really thinking about those categories, about what do we think work is, and what do we think relationships are. When I encountered that book, and my version is there, I have, I think, the same one you do, and I can tell from my signature roughly, when I first read it, what I saw was not anything that was terribly relevant to me. I saw my mother, somebody who was well-educated and stepped into suburban Connecticut, married to a madman. I think I'm 2 years younger than Sally, by the way, to raise her children, me and my younger sister, in Mad Men, and where I saw tremendous frustration and anger that, frankly, I thought was my fault throughout our childhood, my childhood, and her being my mother. And it took until I was an adult and gained some historical, as opposed to just autobiographical knowledge, to begin to see something very different. And so for me, the book, The Feminine Mystique, meant a couple of things. One was, eventually it became an insight into those women who raised us and into what I saw. It was the beginning of data. Some of the things she did about the mass media and so forth, as Caryl pointed out, were fabulous. I mean, really paying attention to what the public images were of women and men, especially in the 1950s. And she did one other thing for me. That phrase, the problem that has no name, I didn't recognize that other than seeing my mother later. But I did very soon find a problem that had no name when we began to give a name to what was happening to us as young women students in the academy in the early 1970s, and that was sexual harassment. We had no name for that, for those of you who are younger. There was nothing to call the use of sexuality as power against somebody who was more vulnerable. It didn't have a name. What that was is, it must have been something I did. It must have been something I said, added to, and I thought he thought I was a brilliant student. And I found there was something else he liked better. So the problem that had no name also became something that I think a lot of us were able to generalize as we continued through women's studies, gender studies, sexuality studies, to understand what, as we said then, the power of naming meant, what it meant when we didn't have a name for something we experienced, and what it meant as those names and those identifications morphed over time. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are a lot of things that where the names did morph and the concepts did morph. So that, I think, is very important. And I think what I would say about that period is that it is true that Betty Friedan was only talking about certain people. And I dare say, as a social scientist, that either most of us who are academics are only talking about certain people, although we better be conscious of who we're talking about. Because if we're talking really about all people, we have probably just homogenized them, and we fall back into talking only about some people. So who was Betty Friedan talking about? She was dealing with a very particular historical period. The 1950s is brief. It looks very brief now. But if you look at all the indicators of women's status through the beginning of the 20th century, you see that through the early 20th century, and certainly pushed by the Great Depression, you see women becoming a larger percentage of those who are becoming educated at every level. You see women entering the labor force in ways they hadn't earlier. You see women entering the labor force in a variety of different kinds of jobs they hadn't entered before, although certain kinds of labor jobs stayed very, very closed to women. And so you see this rise. World War II happens. And then you get things like what I quoted at the very beginning of explaining this disjuncture, this unhappiness. Women, go back and raise your children. We needed a population after the war. We needed to deal with the burgeoning service sector and the large, growing healthcare and education sector. And so for that period of time, where the middle class is regarded as an advance guard, listen to President Obama, he's saying the same thing, the advance guard that is going to lead to economic and social growth during that period, those are the women she was thinking about, the Smith graduates like her, who were supposed to have one kind of life but didn't. So yes, she was only talking about some people who lived at that period. She was not very interesting to some of us who came later until we gained some historical viewpoint. And then I would just close by saying that the women's movement at that period was much more complex and much more diverse than it's given credit for.
Absolutely.
And wanted to say that for 40 damn years. You know, let me close with this. So you know your click moments. Here's mine. I'm sitting at Clark University. It's May 1970. We are on strike. And it's a little school, so we can all fit into one auditorium this size. And we get up to have our platform about how we're going to change the world and have a revolution. Wonderful. We were all 18, 19, 20. So we were at that point going to bring the war to a screeching halt and just change the world. So one speaker got up to the front and said, okay, the first plank we're going to have is that we are going to recognize the racism on our campus, in Massachusetts, in the world, and we are going to dedicate ourselves to fighting racism. And everybody cheered and, you know, yes, yes, and we all voted that we were going to end racism right there. And then somebody else got up and said, and the second plank is we are going to end the imperialism of the American state. And, you know, and we're going to recognize the imperialism on our campus and in Massachusetts. And in the United States and in the world, and we're going to fight to end it. Or yes, yes, yay, yay, we're going to do that. And then the next person got up and said, and we are going to recognize the class oppression on our campus, you got it, in Massachusetts, in the world, and we are going to fight to end class oppression. Everybody stands up. And then someone I found very annoying from one of my classes, who was constantly in my political theory class talking about women in this thing, the National Organization of Women or something, whatever it was, and she embarrassed me because, of course, women were fine, but she constantly, well, what did Plato say about women? And she got up in front of everybody and she said, and we are going to recognize the sexism, I winced, the sexism on our campus in Massachusetts and in the world. And there was silence. And I looked to my left and right. I was sitting, of course, only among men. And I looked, and they started laughing. And I looked around the room, and they started laughing. And we were going to stop all these other things, but sexism was really funny. And I found myself, May something or other, 1970, driven to stand up, and I was about here, so it was a long auditorium, to stand up, excuse myself from the row, and I was propelled down the aisle, out the back, because my stomach was turning, and she no longer was embarrassing me. I didn't belong there. And as I stood up and walked down the row, 30 other women did exactly the same thing. We got outside. We got outside. You want to know why I became a tough woman? We got outside, and talk about not having a name for it. We didn't even know why we were there, because our reaction was all the same. We felt driven out because we understood we didn't belong. We understood there was a problem, and we had no language for it. We had no name for it. All we knew was that we weren't a part of that. And so I think every generation of women's studies students I taught after that began my intro women's studies class by telling me, there's no problem anymore, just the way I thought. Anybody see what's going on about the Violence Against Women Act?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to leave it there, and I want to thank my fellow panelists here, and we have some time for some questions. Where are the mics? There's a mic there, there's a mic there. Please raise your hand, wait for them. Ask a question in the form of a question, please. And we will all try not each to take 10 minutes each to answer you, but maybe we should collect a few. Thank you.
My name is Jen. Yes, my name is Jen Dederick. I was born in 1970, so I really had never heard of Betty Friedan. I mean, really, she didn't. And I mean, Gloria Steinem was feminism. You know, that was. But I've been doing a cartoon book on the history of the Equal Rights Amendment, a graphic novel, which is fun. And I've been recently doing the chapter on the women's strike for equality. And for me, Betty Friedan, yeah, which was great. And Betty Friedan is, helping to organize now, doing the strike for equality, that kind of stuff. And I sort of am now learning about her. But I'm remembering when you're talking about the World War II thing, which is exactly what I was just thinking of in listening to all of this, is I had this big moment, this sort of click moment, I guess, even though I grew up with Ms. Magazine and stuff. But when I was talking to my grandmother, I was probably in my early 20s, and I said to her, when I get married, we're going to share housework equally. I'm not going to marry some guy that's not going to do the housework. And she's laughing now in heaven, and because I'm married now. And I'm telling her all this, and she says, "Oh yeah, that's what we thought too." And I thought, what? Like, she was in her 80s then, and she was talking about the feminism of the 20s, and and so yeah, there was this World War II thing. And as you were talking about being in the balcony, I was thinking about His Girl Friday, which is a movie that comes out before World War II, in which Cary Grant is telling Hildy Johnson, don't go to the suburbs, be a reporter. You're supposed to be a reporter. Don't go be, and how it changed. And I'm wondering, because it obviously, the needle keeps moving, and then it goes back, and then it moves, and it goes back. And so I guess I'm wondering, yeah, I want to hear more about the historical perspective of, like, from way back, from when we're talking about Mary Wollstonecraft talking about this in the 1700s, and then we've got the 1800s and stuff. And as I'm covering this, how does this all fit into the grand scheme and the sort of the waves and all of that? With where does Betty fit in all that?
Can we take a few questions?
Why don't we take maybe 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll pull them together and say a couple of things and then go out again. So want to alternate sides here? That's a nice question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dima. Being an Arab and having lived in the Middle East all my life, I always was very looked up to the United States and said, oh my God, it must feel awesome to walk in the streets and not have someone verbally harass you or check your butt out or check you out when you walk. And then when I arrived here, for some reason I lost it, and then no one checks me out and doesn't feel as good anymore. Anyway, my husband likes it, so. Anyway, but my big aha moment in the U.S., which I just moved 2 months ago, was the fact that we went to Disney and I saw how girls are obsessed with the princess concept and how they are obsessed with the Prince Charming. And then I realized that Walt Disney ruined it for us in terms of relationship, because first you had Snow White, and then you had Cinderella, and now the girls are obsessed with the princess concept, and then they grow up, and then they watch Jessie, and they watch all these things on Disney Channel, and the girls all look perfect skin and perfect bodies, and everyone's like, and the way they talk, and then I go with my daughters shopping, and then I see all these bras for 13-year-old girls who look too attractive for a 13-year-old. I remember buying my first bra with my mom, feeling horrible and mortified. And I used to wear 13 T-shirts so no one would see that I'm wearing a bra. And now girls are just showing off, their stuff. And so it does not, for me, for an Arab woman, I mean, I don't know how to put it in words. I don't see that we have an awesome feminine movement and women have more rights, but at the same time, women are still looked upon as sex objects. And just like in my part of the world, women think they need to cover up, so men don't look at them as sex objects. Here it's the opposite. Okay, they are not covering up, but they are still looked as sex object. Like if you see a woman in the office and she walks away, men would probably, like their common talk would be, look at that, whatever word they would use, it would definitely be something sexual. If they swear at her at the office, they won't say she's so dumb or she's whatever. They would say something sexual to demean her. Whereas the man, they don't talk about his sexuality or he's a whatever. They just give him, he's a jerk, he's whatever, but they don't say anything sexual. So I don't really see that our girls will grow up, be maybe more respect themselves more, unless they see their mom or their mother figure at home be a strong mom. Because if they watch TV or if they go shopping or anything, they're just, I have to tell my daughters, don't buy this. This makes you look very cheap. This makes you look, boys will look at your body. You want them to think. It's very hard as a mother of girls to raise them in such a society. That's right. It's the same as raising them in the Middle East.
Right. Thank you. Should we collect two more and then we'll talk?
Hi, I'd love to tell you my autobiography, but I don't think we have time. So I'm really looking for a takeaway. I'm an accountant, so let's boil it down. I have a lot of young friends who take feminism for granted. They date boys, they date girls. They're like, la la la, we're all here. And then I have girls in my own age generation who are like, feminism is a dirty word. Okay, I need some way to bridge the gap. I need a business card that says you are a freaking feminist, whether you know it or not. Okay, you work a job, you're traveling all over the place, you're flying business class, you drive a Mercedes, you're single, you pay your own mortgage. You're a freaking feminist. How do I explain to the young people that they got to keep up the fight, and how do I explain to the people in my own generation, the other professionals that I work with, who were raised as Southern belles, but now are working because, whatever, this is what you do if you manage to escape the stripper culture in the South, that you're a feminist. And this is how I need it. I need it short, I need it tight, and I need to be able to put it on a t-shirt, basically.
Good. Let's do one more, and then one more. One more. Linda. Professor Haywood.
Yeah, well, I think I need it short too. So the whole thing of I like the idea of the black stereotype, benefit of doubt, and I'm wondering, I just read a paper this weekend which I had to comment on at Harvard, and it dealt with black feminists, literature. And I know in the years that I've been sort of part of some sort of movement, I think it was a mixture of civil rights and, Caribbean identity and so on, that in fact Gerda Lerner was what did it for us,
right.
Not,
Right, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah, but the thing is, the feminist mystique was there. Right. There was something liberating, as you said, it's in the air. So what I want to ask now, it's about where is it? Where is black feminism and white feminism? Because I think that the two seem to be at some distance still. And if you can address that, I'll be grateful.
Well, I'm going to start somewhere down there.
Well, I think for the T-shirt, the T-shirt and the Disney problem, I wanted to answer. For the T-shirt, there is a T-shirt. It says, "This is what a feminist looks like." So I think there's the T-shirt. I think, and I think the other answer is what Trotsky said you couldn't make socialism in one country. I always told my children you can't make feminism in one household. So despite the struggles, like I told my daughter that Snow White we called her zombie white, because I said the only thing that could be possibly white skin as white as snow would be a zombie. So I read her the book as zombie white, because I have sallow skin and I don't love skin as white as snow. So, I think there are ways you can do that in the way you raise your children and in giving them a vocabulary that's different about that. And I think each of us learn, I thought it wasn't relevant for me either. So I think that that's part of it, and we all have to learn it in different ways. And I think that the way the politics will be shaped is gonna, I mean, I have no nostalgia for the 60s in certain kinds of ways. I think it's really important. If we're gonna move forward politically, it's a different economic and political reality now. People's choices and how they define themselves, and I mean, I'm dealing with transgender students all the time, and all of those kinds of issues, completely different. Political and economic situation where the privilege, I mean, you need at least 2, if not 3 people working to support a household these days because everybody's losing their jobs. Right. So we are in a very different economic and political moment, and I think what it's going to look like is going to be different. And I do a lot of work on the South, and those Southern belles are really pretty powerful ladies in the end, and I think there are just lots of ways to think about it. It just isn't going to look like a crunchy granola kind of 60s look, and a different kind of way of being.
By the way,
Can I?
Oh, you want to? Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I just want to pick up on something you said. That is, the problem of Friedan's generation was going to work. Today, the problem might be the work is disappearing.
That's right.
And that the lives of white women are becoming, in some ways, more similar to women of color. And that might be a basis for coalition politics. That's in my optimistic moods. But the fact is that someone like Anne Marie Slaughter and her Atlantic piece, you know, the privileged State Department official who goes back to a cushy tenured professorship at Princeton, saying, well, why women still can't have it all. And her solution is really an individualist solution of happiness, of balance is happiness. And that fits into a kind of neoliberalism that discards where most people are right now. So I think that's really important.
And you know, I think the hypersexualization of particularly young women is extremely disturbing because it's a way to silence women. Mm-hmm. If the idea is you have to be hypersexual, you always have to be perfect, you always have to have 8-inch heels, that is a silencing. And the American Psychological Association looked at the hypersexuality of media, particularly young women, and it found out it led to eating disorders, lack of self-esteem, a whole bunch of stuff. And I think the media is really falling into this trap. And if you see, for example, Halloween costumes that are being designed for 6-year-old girls, and they're all slutty. You know, a slutty princess, a slutty waitress,
the hot syndrome,
and the hot syndrome, and you can't possibly be, you know, hot and submissive on one hand and be empowered and speaking out on the other. So I think that we have to take a look at what's marketed, particularly to our daughters, and say, not going to buy that, not going to go there.
Where did you have?
I have a short, concrete answer to business card. Okay, there is a lot of activity online of young feminists, and here is a place to contact. The group is new. It's called Ultraviolet.
Oh yeah.
It's info at one word, weareultraviolet.org. Email them and you'll get your business card.
I want to try to take on Professor Haywood's question. One of the things that disturbs me increasingly is, again, kind of undifferentiated, you know, white women, black women, working class women. Race matters. Gender matters. Sexuality matters. But we're not homogeneous within those groups.
Right.
And so when I think of where feminism is today, I think it's been a long time since there's anything that looks like a make-believe unified feminist movement. There ever was a completely unified feminist movement. But again, there was a historical moment, and it was during the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment when different groups of women who were concerned about issues that revolved at least partly around gender, but usually around a number of other things at once, where we sat at the same table. But when that stopped, there isn't anything that really makes all the different women's groups and different groups that think about gender unite around the same table. It's a strand. It's a chain that links us together. So I think thinking about the world as a whole, thinking about those people who focus on violence. I'm obsessed by that today because I was worried about the vote. But who focus on violence of a variety of sorts, be it domestic violence or racial violence or other kinds of street violence or gun violence of a variety of sorts, but where the question is gendered. I think that's where there is a feminism that involves women who are very different, or where we talk about the economy. And most people here are urban, as I have been most of my life. But I spent part of my life as an adult living in a rural area, and it's really different. The categories are so very different from what we're used to seeing in the major cities with respect to labor and everything else. And so I don't want to go on about that, but the way I understand it is that the feminisms are really chain linked together, but it's people who understand the importance of gender intermixed with these other important human categories.
You know, I think one thing that's really important was in this last election cycle, I'm seeing young women getting energized because they're hearing people talking about legitimate rape. They're hearing a young woman being savaged by Rush Limbaugh and saying, oh, if she wants to have contraception, let's have her make a sex tape so we can watch it. And the governor of Virginia saying he was going to sign a bill making women get, invasive vaginal examinations, even though their doctors don't want them to have it. And I think, and the idea that we're fighting over contraception 50-some years after the Supreme Court decision, I really think that this woke a lot of people up to the fact is that the women's movement wasn't an artifact of Betty Friedan's day, something that we've outgrown and gone beyond, but that a lot of these issues that are involved in those early fights are resurfacing today in different and sometimes in very dangerous ways.
And yet, if you look at the women's vote, the majority of white women voted against Barack Obama. And there is divisions by age, marital status, race, and ethnicity. It was single mothers, young women, poor women, black and brown women, Latinas, African American women. They voted for Obama, and that's a fascinating fact, and it's out there. So we can't assume even unity, but I do have hope because of the students I teach. And in our feminist studies department, over 70% of our students are from so-called underrepresented groups. They're either African American, Chicana, or Asian.
Let's pick up 3 more questions in a round robin. I see a race of microphones. You got to get their attention, not mine.
Just a quick question. When you started to speak, you had indicated in your class that you gave...
Roberta.
Okay. You gave the survey and that 46 of the women indicated what they wanted to do. I'm just curious, did you do anything at the end of that semester? And how many women's minds were changed after the course?
Yes. Yes, I did. I remember it very vividly. At the end of the course, I gave them the results of what they had said at the beginning. And they denied. They said, oh, no. So, there was a lot of progress. There was, in that class, a woman called Gail Hornstein.
Oh, wow.
Yes, okay, yeah. She went on to be really distinguished. And she came up to me after first class or the second class, and she said, she was very Gail. And so she said, I'd like to get to know you. And I said, okay. And so I had a little part in the making of Gail Hornstein.
Couple more questions. And I'm going to ask what kind of time we have left.
Hi, I'm Dana. I'm not going to give too many details on my background, but it is important to say that I'm coming at this not from a feminist angle, but as an economist. You can be both, but most of my background is not in women's studies or anything like that, but in economics. And as an economics PhD student, I had a great opportunity to TF a class on women in work with a fantastic economic historian. And one of the ways we always talked about inequality and the gender gap and all of that, that really differed from the presentation that I've seen today is we always kind of ended the discussion with, differentiating how things are today versus how things were 30, 40, 50, however many years ago. So there's great economic research, for instance, that shows when you have data that you can account for a lot of stuff, the gender gap in wages really shrinks down to the point where it's no longer statistically significant or statistically indistinguishable. It's statistically indistinguishable from zero. We can also look at some professions like pharmacy, and the nature of pharmacy really demonstrates it's a very flexible job, and in pharmacy, that gender gap is also zero. So I was just wondering how you react to this progress and why the progress is not a larger part of the discourse in kind of the discipline of women's studies or feminist studies.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I actually don't think that's true at all about it. And I think partly think about what we were asked and tasked to do today, which is not to talk about what's going on now, but to reflect back on a book that was written 50 years ago. So if we were doing a discussion about the conditions for women workers now and professions, we would be having that conversation. So I actually think that, feminist economists have had a really big impact on women's studies, and the way we've thought about those kinds of issues are really important. And I think one of the things we're looking at is the shifts, right? So what happens in different kinds of jobs. So Eileen's work particularly is on, domestic labor and what happens in care work and what's going on around that. So I think the gaps are really there. As we said in the comparative, the fight over comparable worth was, it isn't the issue of, what gets labeled as care work often then gets undervalued. And so that's where the struggle, I think, is these days.
I just saw a new piece of data saying that in no country in the world do men and women doing comparable work earn the same salary. In the US, it's 77% gap. Other places, it's 82%. But it really is a huge problem, even though we have made, as you say, gains in certain areas. It's a global problem that in no country in the world do women, even when they're doing the same work, make the same as men.
Not even
Although
Cuba?
in
some fields, obviously, that's
Don't know about Cuba.
Let's pick up a couple more questions, and then we'll be able to talk about a few of these things.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for all the work you have done, and also Betty Friedan. And what you're pointing to tonight is a lot of the diversity of issues that are challenges still today to women. Many that we're still, that haven't changed that much or have a long way to go. And but I was wondering whether you feel there's a question. It's from a different angle. That for women who have, we have made a lot of progress, but I think to speak to, what the woman from Middle East was speaking to, is that women who do have a lot of opportunity, there does still seem to be that, how can I say, a lack of example. There are examples, and more examples than ever, but I feel that there's so much, to speak to the hypersexualization, there's something in women, in us, in young women who have a lot of opportunity and have a lot of possibility, that in a certain way we sabotage ourselves as well. And I do appreciate that the media enforces that. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But I feel there is a question, because I know I lived in India for a long time. I know a lot of young Indian women now look to the West because of the history of women's liberation. And yet there's still this, they look and they say, well, you know, where are the gains if you see women are still, in a certain way, sabotaging ourselves because of that? And I just wondered if you would like to respond to that.
Let's
Whether
pick
you
up
see that as an issue.
one other, and then we can say a couple of things, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to stop tonight, so microphone somewhere.
Hello. I was at the same demonstration as you were at BU with Bill Baird being pulled out of the auditorium, so I felt there was sisterhood in that. I work for IBM, and the CEO of IBM is a very powerful woman. And for a Fortune 100 company to have,
You have to
can you
yes, yes,
can you hear me now?
Much better.
To have a woman appointed to be the CEO of IBM was quite
Amazing.
remarkable, quite amazing. But I don't know how many of you were aware of the fact right after she was anointed, she couldn't go to the Masters because women were not allowed. And I was very taken, Carol, by the balcony, because I, as a young journalist, had the same experience at the Union League Club. I had to come in the back door on Park Avenue. And what do you tell young women who want to be leaders in business? Here you see a female, very powerful CEO who can't wear the green jacket. I was so aggravated by that. What message does that send out? And then she never even said anything about it. Maybe the boys told her to be quiet if she, you know, the board of directors. So that, you as the experts in this field and observers,
Yeah, I thought she was one of them.
what was your response to that?
Yes, they've now allowed her. I'm afraid we really are about out of time, so I'm going to ask everybody to go down the line briefly and respond or make a last comment, and we'll try to have some more forums on this.
I wanted to say something about the sexuality question that keeps coming up, because I think there's a real danger here. And I'm a veteran of the sex wars of the 80s in women's studies about the tension between what's pornographic, what's erotica. So I think we want to be really careful here. I mean, there is a way in which women's sexuality is enormously powerful. And should be celebrated and seen as a site of empowerment, not something to be hidden away and frozen. And so I'm channeling Audre Lorde here, but I think that that's really important to think about, that we can't have feminism seem to be something that thinks that women, so the difference between being objectified and still being a sexual being, that we should all celebrate that as part of our humanity. And I just wanted to make sure we didn't leave here with some kind of no discussion of that at all.
Eileen?
Okay, that's great. I think that it behooves us to think about our own standpoints. One of the lessons of the feminism I learned was a self-awareness of where we stand in our relationship to others. And that to understand how those of us in the US, you know, we use up the majority of the world's resources given the amount of people we have here. And how does that mean that we've been able to be more privileged and have a higher standard of living? So on one hand, it's this criticism, self-criticism. On the other hand, I look at the social movements that are going on. I look at, if there's any movement in the labor movement, it's among those new welfare queens, nurses and teachers. They're the public employees. They are on the front line. And those were the jobs that were opened up and improved because of the struggles of an earlier feminism. And those are the places where you have black and white, gay and straight, and everything in between united.
What struck me was when Hillary Clinton ran for president, I sort of expected all this progress we'd made, and what sort of stunned me was the stuff that came out of the woodwork, the iron my shirt signs, the nutcrackers, you know, the sexist remarks, this sort of continual barrage of the fact that a woman could not be quote, an adequate female and also reach for power. And I mean, that to me was surprising, because I thought we'd gotten so much further beyond that than we had. And I realized it is still problematic when women are looking to reach very powerful jobs. We have a phenomenon now called the glass cliff, when do women get appointed CEOs? Often when everything's failing, we figure, hey, put a woman in and she'll take the fall. So sometimes, I mean, I'm very encouraged in many ways, but sometimes I look, I see we haven't come as far as I might have thought.
I just want to say I'm constantly being insulted. I don't talk about it unless I'm with a few close friends, at the all-pervasive misogyny that exists, not just in this country. I've lived abroad. I mean, Spain is, was. But we never really talk about the underlying permanent causes, these institutions, the church, all different kinds of religion. I understand religion can work both ways, but there are powerful forces that are apparently permanent in our society that foment misogyny and prevent progress, but we just sort of skip over them. And that bothers me. It really bothers me.
I guess I want to conclude the substantive part by trying to mess the categories again, and talk about some of the things that really disturb me about the continuation of people having to stay in certain gendered sexual places. We are focusing here mostly on women, but with a rise of eating disorders among men, it's not true, it's just women, but we don't talk about that. With issues of young men in school, especially, a lot of us in the academy are very worried about what is understood to be not masculine, and a lot of that is some wonderful parts of learning that, that excludes men and becomes very, very difficult. There are a whole range of kinds of issues and problems that we see. If we look at the questions of assault within the church, for example, most of that involved young men and boys, and talk about a problem that for a long time had no name, right? Men, boys who cannot speak of being vulnerable. And so, and today, other things we're talking about when we talk about women and families and so forth, we are still talking about how are women going to take care of their children? Do we have maternity leave for women? You read all these articles, and even our friend from Princeton never really discussed the role of men.
That's right.
And so I think we're still very much stuck in certain kind of categories, and it's not healthy for any of us.
Can I say something about Betty Friedan at the very end? Betty Friedan in 1997 grappled with these problems of, she wrote a book called Beyond Gender, The Real Politics of Work and Family, in which she talked about changing both work and a little less family, but she talked about men and women together. She was stuck in her heterosexism, but nonetheless recognized that men had to change too.
So let me thank the members of the panel, and I'm going to, rather than get up and prance around in front of you, I'm going to pass down some, little gifts, tokens of thank you.
You mean
with terrier red on them, you might notice. I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank everybody who is here. I would like to thank all the ships at sea who are out there on the internet. And especially to thank alumni who came back to join us here and are in attendance. This kind of event, we have these discoveries sessions all year round. The point that we're trying to make, especially for the alumni, and for those of you who are students now and will be alumni because you're going to be very successful, is that once you're a member of the Boston University community, you remain a member of the Boston University community, and I was especially pleased to be able to gather together some of our very distinguished scholars who were themselves students here at one point, and I think it's very important to pay attention to that. For all of you who are alumni here, I would be remiss if I didn't say we need your support. Yeah, I need more than a hat. We need your support. The support for our young women and men who are here during financial difficult times, where we need to be able to bring out scholarship support to make sure that the best and most qualified students can be here at Boston University, the support for our students to be able to join us in doing research, for the faculty to be able to continue to do this kind of work. It's really essential. And so during this time of a capital campaign, I will look you in the eye and say, please help support our students and their future, and the faculty and the research they do that supports the future. I hope that all of you will come back and join us again. It's a complete coincidence, but we have a very nicely linked theme for our next Discoveries program on April 25th, where Assistant Professor of Sociology Ashley Mears is going to examine the sociology of gender and labor markets and challenges to common theories for why women earn less than men in most fields. And she's one of our wonderful young faculty members, and I think you can see her online. We have, I think, a B-Universe film of her talking, and so I welcome you then. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.